So when people hear histamines, they often think itchy, scratchy, watery eyes, postnasal drip, all the stuff here in the head and neck. I want to introduce to you another concept related to histamine, because there's a whole nother realm for that group of inflammatory compounds. Imagine you go out to a nice Italian restaurant and you decide you're going to have some chicken parmesan. And you're going to have that red sauce on top of that, some extra Parmesan cheese, maybe a salad with some balsamic vinaigrette, and you might even have half a glass of red wine or some other type of alcoholic beverage with that. Everything that I just said right there contains or releases histamine in the digestive tract. Why is that a problem? Well, for many people it's not. But for some people, it's a make or break it as to how they're going to think and feel for the next few days. And what I mean by that is histamines are supposed to get broken down in the body relatively quickly. We're supposed to have enzymes specific for that. When genetically an individual is compromised and they don't have enough of those enzymes to function for that particular process, what can happen is they might get facial flushing. They might get joint inflammation. They might get a change of the rate of flow of their intestines. So sometimes it can be faster, sometimes it can be slower. So it can lead to a little bit of IBS-like symptoms, but it could also lead to slowing of the bowel and some constipation. For some people, it can actually change their mood and affect. So they might find that the next morning they wake up not only with a little bit of a headache, but they're a little bit moody, a little bit touchy. They have less resiliency in terms of their ability to deal with stress. And so they might feel a little more anxious or a little bit more depressed, less happy with what they see in the mirror. And they might not even associate that meal that they had the night before with how they're feeling. This is one of the interesting things about histamines. In some individuals, I've actually found it to be the crux of some of their joint pain and their arthritides. So how do you know if that's a problem for you? Well, genetically, you can actually look at some of your genes to see if you have the potential to have that bottleneck. Certainly doesn't mean that you're doomed to not manage histamines if you have the genes for that, but it does increase the probability that it might be a bottleneck for you. And this is valuable information because each of us has the capacity to hack our genetics if we know where our key bottlenecks are. So like on the histamine side of the conversation, looking at the monoamine oxidase, the MAO, and the diamine oxidase, the DAO genes, to see if you're hetero or homozygous for that, will tell you if you have that predisposition. And then interestingly, if you look at some food panels, you'll tend to find that the foods that your body doesn't break down well, you also produce some antibodies against. So a food panel will probably have a preponderance of those types of foods showing up even if you don't eat them. That's one of the things that blows my mind is that sometimes an individual hasn't even eaten that food, but because their body doesn't break that family down well, it's already developed an awareness of what that particular protein looks like. So getting an awareness of how histamine affects you opens the door to not only changing how we think and feel here mentally, but also structurally how our joints, connective tissue, and digestive system works. So I gave you that example of what would be a high histamine meal, like at the Italian restaurant. And to put that into better perspective so that you understand why those foods were higher histamine, it's because each of them dealt with some level of fermentation. So the marinara sauce, the Parmesan cheese, the balsamic vinaigrette, the wine or other alcohol, all of those things are fermented. So you can kind of classify that whole group of foods that goes through a fermentation process as having a higher histamine value. Well, the interesting thing about that one is you could take that out one more step and realize that, sometimes, let's say you make some spaghetti tonight and there's a marinara sauce in that. Well, everybody knows that spaghetti and pizza is better on day 2, right? Well, that's because it actually had a chance to do a little bit of fermentation overnight in the refrigerator. And this is true of soups and stews. The more that you get a mixture of different food compounds together, you're going to get some type of fermentation going on. And the longer that occurs, the greater the histamine value. So if an individual is going to prepare something and they're in this category, freezing that food before sticking it into the fridge is a great plan. So that way they can just reheat it on day 2 and it hasn't had that chance to go through the fermentation process. So when you look at the menu and you start to understand that certain foods have this higher histamine value, you can start to look at things and say, okay, I understand that these foods here, maybe some chicken that doesn't have the marinara sauce on it or some chicken that doesn't have the Parmesan on it, that would be a more appropriate choice if you're planning on having that balsamic vinaigrette on your salad. And you would start to mix and match so that you're limiting the exposure to the histamines in a given meal. On another video, I've talked about nutrients that help to hack this, and I can go into that at another time. But just know that for each of these genes, there are certain bottlenecks that an individual can support themselves nutritionally to minimize the negative impact that histamines have on them, in addition to limiting the exposure to these histamine foods. One other caveat there is to give your body ample time to digest. So if you're going to be going to bed at, say, 10 o'clock, make sure that you finish eating by 6:30, no later than 7 p.m., so that you've got a good 3-hour window there so that your body can go through those digestive processes before you lay down. If you keep these things in mind, you've got a much better chance of not only having a pleasant meal, but a pleasant outcome on day 2. Have a great day.